Well, welcome everybody. We we have a wonderful panel tonight dealing with something that is really, I think, essential to understanding the state of our politics today. We obviously are a country that has gone through really significant and continues to demographic changes that have had profound implications. One on elections. It's a famous, any worthwhile statistic about this generally you can find in Brownstein's column, Roy's work, but if Ronald Reagan had run in 2012, Ronald Reagan, who beat Jimmy Carter by 10 points, would have been tied with Jimmy Carter if the demographics of the country were in 1980 what the demographics of the country are today. And those changing demographics have had profound implications on national politics. At the same time, demographic trends matched with reapportionment strategies have created very homogeneous congressional districts and a kind of polarity that we've seen in Congress. And you've got this paradox, or you've got this dilemma of a national electorate and a national a presidential electorate that delivers one verdict and a congressional electorate that delivers another. And there are profound implications to all of this for how we govern, for the sense of frustration about our politics. And so we got the smartest people we know to come and unlock this puzzle for us and point us forward, or at least to give us some greater understanding of it, and one of the great moderators we could find to help lead that discussion, one of the smartest people on television, which may sound like the tallest midget, but but I'm not going to say too much about them because we have Constance Boozer, a second-year master's candidate in public policy from Mississippi, which is why she's wearing a sleeveless dress on a night like this, to introduce our panel. Constance.
Okay, so often labeled a melting pot nation, the United States is expected to become a country with no racial majority, meaning that categories of groups considered minorities will outnumber the white population within the next 35 years. Further, as millennials eligible to vote continue to grow, roughly a third of the electorate by the 2016 election, the United States is currently experiencing a cultural shift in which views on once on hot button issues like gay marriage and marijuana are softening, while marriage rates and church attendance are diminishing. So giving stable historical voting patterns, what implications do these changing American demographics have, if any, on our political process and also at the voting booth? How are Democrats and Republicans factoring new political participants in their political strategies? And how are race and cultural changes influencing our public policy and also our national economy? To discuss this and more, we are lucky to have here tonight such an esteemed set of panelists. The National Journal's editorial director, Ron Brownstein, Democratic political strategist Karen Finney, Republican commentator Ana Navarro, Rock the Vote President Ashley Spillane, and Center for American Progress Fellow Ruy Teixeira. And moderating the discussion tonight will be MSNBC host Alex Wagner. So please join me in welcoming them all here tonight.
I'm proud to be a midget in this room. Yeah? Okay. Thank you all for joining all of us tonight. Just to reiterate what a big deal the changing demographic is, so you guys have these numbers, keep them in the back of your mind when we talk about all this stuff. In 2012, non-white voters were 39.9% of eligible voters in this country. In 2020, that share is going to rise to 37.2%. 2016 non-white voters comprised 54.8% of eligible voters in the United States. It is real. We are becoming a browner, more polyglot nation. So let me start off with the news of the day. Things happened in Washington today, and as usual, not all of them were necessarily things that made sense. The House of Representatives, which is controlled by Republicans, as is the Senate, passed a few immigration measures designed to roll back executive actions the president has made over the course of the last few years. The first was an attempt to defund the most recent, there we go, that sounds. The most recent executive action, which will provide, would protect up to 5 million Americans from deportation. The next is a repeal of DACA, which is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, which basically kept about 800,000 to 1 million dreamers in this country. Another piece of it is an attempt to rein in the 2011 memos that the administration wrote that are known as the Morton memos, and those significantly expanded what immigration authorities could consider when deciding to defer or cancel deportations. And the last piece is increasing funds for the federal Secure Communities program. Under that program, fingerprints of every individual booked by police are checked against Homeland Security databases, which initiates a lot of deportations. This has been a hugely controversial program, especially in the minds of immigrant advocates and the president. So all this stuff happened, right? And it was led in large part by Republicans. And Ana, I want to start with you first.
I knew you would.
I want to get everybody's up on this because
She's starting the softballs with me, as you can see. Thanks, Alex.
What is going on? I mean, we have heard a lot of talk about how the Republican Party wants to change its stance among minorities and specifically Hispanic voters. What is the thing that happened in Washington today do to that initiative?
I think what's going on is, frankly, what's been going on for the last 6 years, and maybe even longer than that, an absolutely dysfunctional Washington, where despite the fact that you had a bipartisan bill by the Senate, nothing got done. The House couldn't get anything done. The White House couldn't get anything done with the House. There was just, they can't work together. I mean, I think it's the most simple answer. They cannot work together. I'm not sure they want to work together. And so what we saw today is that it's a dysfunction of Washington. We saw a frustrated president who's decided to take executive action. I think, I'm torn on this executive action because I like the merits of it and because I'm a supporter of immigration reform. Now, I wish it had been done, and I think it needs to be done through congressional action because executive action is not a cure. It's a Band-Aid. It's temporary. It can be taken away. It's not addressing all the issues on immigration that need to be addressed in a comprehensive form. There's a lot of people that are left out and that are not being addressed. So this is not a solution. It's a Band-Aid to a very big wound that this country has had for a very long time that we have not been able to address comprehensively. What the Republicans are doing, I think, to me, it reminds me in large part of what happened with Obamacare, where there were a lot of symbolic votes. But symbolism matters, and it certainly matters to the Hispanic community. And I think symbolism often has costs. The theater of politics, I know President Obama doesn't like the theater of politics, but it's important. Theater matters, symbolism matters.
Is this good theater?
No, it's not good theater because legislative action shouldn't be about theater, and when you have a strategy that doesn't have an end, an exit, I think that what they need to do both on the healthcare law, what they need to do on immigration is not just say no and not just try to defund it, but try to fix it, try to replace it. We all know there's issues with the healthcare law. We all know there's issues that are not being addressed in this immigration executive action. I think it would be a much better message by Republicans, frankly, if they came up with a proactive plan to try to address immigration and got it done that way.
Ron, are we closer to, is this the overture to Republicans coming up with an alternative?
I don't think so. I mean, I think the House Republicans are a prisoner of their own success at this point. The one-sentence version of American politics, I think, in our era is that Republicans can't win enough minorities to win the White House, and Democrats can't win enough white voters to win the House. And essentially, if you look at, Democrats have now won the popular vote in 5 out of the past 6 presidential elections. You don't do that by accident. You don't do that because your candidate's always better, your technology, all deference aside, your technology is better. You win the popular vote 5 out of 6 times because big blocks in the electorate have realigned in a way to provide you a lasting advantage. And the fact is, the Democrats have won the popular vote 5 out of 6 times now without winning more than 44% of white voters in any of those elections, largely because the minority share of the vote has doubled, more than doubled since 1992. It's gone from 13 to 28%, probably going to hit 30% in 2016, and Republicans simply are not winning enough of those voters. Democrats have won roughly 4/5 of minority voters in every election since 1976 presidential election, except one. So at the presidential level, there's the possession arrow is clearly pointing toward the Democrats, largely because of the Republican struggles with minority voters. On the other hand, when you look at the House, this modern Democratic coalition, which is heavily dependent on minorities and young people, is a very urbanized, concentrated coalition. And it's even before you get to the issue of redistricting, it simply is not dispersed in a way that makes it easy to get in the House. And, Republicans now, we've been reporting this in the National Journal this week, Republicans now in the House control 3/4 of the districts, an unbelievable number, where the white share of the population exceeds the national average. I mean, they have a 135-seat advantage in seats where whites exceed the national average. And that obviously makes it very hard for Democrats to win the House. But today, you see the flip side, right? Which is that essentially all of the Republicans, or the vast majority of House Republicans, are from places where there is very little intrinsic political pressure to reach out to the Hispanic community. They don't have those voters, and they are very resistant to making the changes that the party needs to make to be competitive at the national level. So we have this standoff, which is really difficult for each party. And as David was alluding to it correctly before, you have what is in most cases now a national Democratic majority that cannot win the House with its current voter base. I mean, Mitt Romney won 59% of whites and lost by 5 million votes. So Republicans won 60% of whites in 2014 and had a landslide. So the country is sort of stuck in this standoff between the two parties, and I think we saw today the downside of the Republican success. Their flexibility, their maneuverability to deal with their problem at the presidential level is constrained by the nature of the coalition that's provided them such a dominant hand in the House.
Karen, I think that there was, you're a creature of Washington, you know it well. I won't insult you. You live there, you live there. You are much better than Washington. I was born there, so I feel like there's some kinship. But in terms of what is possible, right? I mean, if you are, part of the reason, and I will unpack this a little bit, part of the reason some folks say that minorities don't vote in off-year elections is because they feel demoralized, they feel like the stakes aren't high, there is a wow factor after the presidential election, there's all this hope, and then everything grinds to a screeching halt in Washington. But if you look at the issue of immigration reform, 3 months, right? You're a generation of people who represent the voters of the future. And one party is trying to repeal their ability to stay in the United States. How can you even imagine anything like a compromise happening with Democrats when the two sides seem so far apart?
So I have a slightly different take on what's been happening with the current immigration debate. I'm going to put a little cold water on my Democrats who are all proud of themselves because a black man got a majority of minority voters in this country. He forever changed potentially the Democratic electorate. It is still an open question whether or not that is a legacy that continues in this party, my former boss aside. So I think that's an important, we can look at the numbers, but again, sort of do the various sort of statistical analyses, but, eligible voters and turnout are 2 very different things. And part of actually what we saw even in 2014, in part of the problem that we had was, African American and Latino voters didn't feel like they had anything to come out for. And frankly, in some places, some of our candidates took the Latino vote for granted. I mean, look at what happened in Colorado. That was an abomination, right? Our candidate there did not do the work of turning out Latino voters. Latino Decisions did some great polling right before the election. In Colorado and North Carolina, 2 states, the Latino population said, we don't really know there's an election going on. Nobody's really reached out to us. But if we were going to vote, it's for the community. It's not for all this stuff that they're talking about. Polling memo that was leaked not that long before the election by the DSCC, African American voters. Granted, in some places like North Carolina, I think our candidate did a fantastic job. She almost reached, frankly, the level of turnout that the president had gotten. It still didn't matter because she lost the white vote, to Ron's point. But at the same time, you had African American voters saying, well, I'll turn out if you're telling me it's to have the president's back. It wasn't
Right.
about all this other stuff people were talking about. And that message, unfortunately, was too late in coming. So, I mean, in an election year where you had the most abysmal turnout period, you did see, and actually, I will say, African-American women and Latino women, we showed up, by the way. We always do. With everybody else, it needs to show up in better numbers. To the immigration question, though, I agree with you. I think there is a huge frustration that things aren't going to get done. As a communicator, though, the thing that I see in what's happening with Republicans, I agree with Ana that the theater of it is important, but the Republicans have done something very smart this time. In 05 and 06, their racist rhetoric got away from them, and they saw it. I know a lot of Latinos who were horrified, people who were Republicans were horrified, and this time they've made it about the president being, not following the law. I mean, they've made it on procedural things. I think that the executive order has given them an opportunity to go after that without having to necessarily, some still do, directly attack immigrants themselves or the Latino population themselves. And I take that to mean they know they have to rein their rhetoric in a bit because you cannot ignore the numbers in terms of the Latino population and the growth that we're going to see over the next 20 years.
Ruy, in terms of those, I mean, we talk a lot about, and I feel, I obviously kick this discussion off talking about immigration, which is not just an issue for the Hispanic community. It affects many people of color in this country. It is an international issue. In terms of the other issues, the other pieces of policy where you could see movement or at least things that would engender a little bit more enthusiasm among other parts of the electorate, brown parts of the electorate, young parts of the electorate, I mean, what else should politicians be focusing on?
Well, I mean, if you look at the political views of Asian Americans, of African Americans and Latinos, that's a minority base of the Democratic Party. If you look at millennials, if you look at unmarried voters, who also tend to lean pretty strongly toward the Democrats at this point, I mean, there's one common theme certainly that runs through them is a relative liberalism on some of these social issues, and not just including immigration, but lots of other social issues as well. But beyond that, there's actually a considerable overlap in terms of their views on the role of government. They tend to be more positive about what government can deliver. They want government to do more rather than to do less. They want government to address problems that have to do with the lack of good middle-class jobs, that have to do with lack of economic security, that have to do with a variety of things that have to do with the economic lives in a day-to-day sense of these kinds of voters. And they don't reject out of hand like some white voters do, especially older white voters, that the government has a role to play. So all those things are critical in terms of the Democrats continuing to reach out to minority voters, and also the Republicans, I think, if they want to do better among these constituencies, they themselves have to do that as well. But as Ron's pointing out, at this point, at least the part of white voters that the Republicans attract the most strongly at this point are precisely the people who are most anti-immigration, most anti-government, most anti-spending, think basically the government takes money out of their pocket and puts it into someone else's pocket. If the government spends money, it's on the wrong people, as long as they don't touch my Medicare, right? So that's a problem for Republicans who think they need to reach toward the center to reach more of these rising constituencies and bring them over to their side and compress those democratic margins among these rising demographics. I mean, if I were advising the Republican Party, I'd advise them to try to do that. But it's hard to do because of the structure of their party today.
Actually, when we talk about the midterm versus the presidential years, I mean, this is like the big problem, right? The two different Americans that come out and vote. What do you mean? In your opinion, why aren't young people coming out to vote in the office?
Well, I always like to answer that first by saying everyone's voting at a much lower rate in the midterm election. It's not just us kids out there. Thank you very much. There's a couple of reasons. I think, it's great to talk about how diverse and, amazing this young group of rising electorate is. Our candidates don't reflect that. This is a very white, very old Congress that we have right now, and we should celebrate the young people who have been elected and who ran, who deemed it, their civic duty to participate. But it's not good enough yet. It still doesn't reflect the diversity of the country, and in particular the millennial generation. On top of that, in a midterm election, I think it's perfectly reasonable to acknowledge that candidates don't have as much money as is spent in a presidential election. And so because of limited resources, they don't tend to reach out, as you're saying, to young people, people of color, who are regarded as less reliable. And when you're not feeling like you're being spoken to, you have very little motivating you to come out. So in races across the country, you hear talk of Social Security constantly. The level of conversation about student loan debt was significantly lower. And that, it's tough to get, it's even tough to get me jazzed up to come out and vote on Social Security. So, and I care, I really do. And, I think the other thing that should not be lost on this particular election is the number of restrictive voting laws that were passed that make it more difficult for young people in college or, generally young people in general to participate. You have in Texas where you can use your gun license to vote, but you can't use a student ID, or in Tennessee where a professor is allowed to use their university ID, but a student isn't. It is very difficult to, our job at Rock the Vote is to go out and get people fired up about participating and help them get registered to vote, remove those barriers to entry. It's really hard to do with the rules being different in every state. A lot of young people are pretty transient and moving all the time, and when you have voting laws that don't allow for participation to be easy, it's even more challenging to do our job.
And I think, Ana, you're going to like this. So I feel like I get a little lost around. I was watching an interview this afternoon before I came here, and Marco Rubio was talking. And Marco Rubio is Hispanic American, he's young, he's talking about the issues that theoretically should matter to young people.
Who graduated with a hell of a debt.
What's that?
Who graduated with a hell of a debt.
Right. So I want to talk a little bit about, Ashley brings the point, there aren't candidates that are speaking to people of color, young people, and Karen, I think rightfully points out that sometimes Democrats, maybe all the time, maybe a lot of the time, take the minority vote for granted. And if you look at the bench, right, Republicans have Nikki Haley, Susana Martinez, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio. I mean, there's a host of diverse talent on the right, and you look at the left, to say nothing of, they're the Castro brothers, as far as I can tell. I mean,
The good Castro brothers.
Yeah, right. Some would argue that far left, they're the other Castro brothers. But I guess I wonder, when you think about the years ahead, who is the man or woman that you think could be the standard bearer for this new generation that will speak to young people and minority voters in a meaningful way who are maybe inclined to vote Republican?
Okay, well, this is probably where I should give my Jeb Bush disclosure, which is where, Jeb Bush is a friend of mine, has been a friend of mine for a very long time. I'm not sure it's just going to be one person. I think whomever ends up being the nominee certainly has the most to say on setting the tone, setting the pace, setting the policy issues, and really reaching out and building those bridges. I think we saw it, with George W. Bush. It's incredible to think how much has changed in so little time. It wasn't back when dinosaurs ruled the earth that this guy, George W. Bush, got 44% of the Hispanic vote. It was 2004, just 10 years ago, just one decade ago. And yet it seems like we are in completely different worlds and completely different time periods, frankly. I think there's several who can change the tone. I think Jeb can do enormous things with the Hispanic vote, in part because he's not Hispanic, but we all know he likes us, and he gets us, and he understands it. I mean, I think he might be more Hispanic than some of the Hispanics that are in Congress. But the Castros speak no Spanish. Okay.
Given the backdrop of today, which is, a flag has been planted in the ground as far as where Republicans in Congress are, can Jeb Bush make it out of the primary process with this as his party?
I think so. Well, so does he, I think. I hope. Look, we have this question come up in the Republican Party every 4 years. Can, Mitt Romney make it out of the Republican primary? Can McCain make it out of the Republican Party?
It's not a bipartisan Senate immigration bill that's pulled in the House. This is an effort to repeal DACA. This is an effort to increase the deportations of 5 million Americans. I mean, this is a different place in the Republican Party.
I'm not sure that frankly, I'm not sure that it's that different a place from where 2007, 2008 was. That to me felt like a much more heated rhetoric, and where I agree with Karen, the rhetoric had completely gotten out of control than it is today. Today it feels very transactional and less hostile, frankly. And I do think, I'm one of the positive things that I see happening of this Republican field as it shapes up is that, number one, it's not just a field of old white men. There's Ben Carson. I'm not saying that I'm going to support any of these people, but I'm just saying we've got a lot of variety going on. We've got a possible Ben Carson, we've got a possible Carly Fiorina, we've got, Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio. I mean, it's, you've got a bunch of different faces and voices going on. You've got young voices, if somebody under 45 still counts as young, I hope. And people like Rand Paul, like Ted Cruz, like Marco Rubio. And they're talking about issues that for a long time Republicans have ceded to Democrats. And I think it's the best thing that can happen to the country. And I mean by that issues like student debt, issues like poverty that we've heard Paul Ryan speak about, that we're hearing Marco Rubio speak about, issues like prison reform and justice system reform that Rand Paul has really taken on. We're seeing folks like Rand Paul show up at places where Republicans aren't usually comfortable. It's not just the Chamber of Commerce speeches, it's the speeches at the Berkeleys and the speeches at the Howard University. Now, I may not agree with a word that comes out of his mouth, but I'm really glad that he's showing up and he's showing the effort and that he's, and I think that's something that other Republicans should follow suit. And I do think that I don't know whether he's going to win the primary or not. I don't know whether he's going to run or not. I don't know whether he can or not, but I will tell you this. I think Jeb Bush is liberated. He hasn't been in elected office for the last 8 years. It's not like he needs to continue being in elected office. He's been successful in the private sector. And a liberated Jeb Bush is somebody that's going to run a campaign that he wants to run and be the kind of candidate that he wants to be.
The challenge for Republicans, though, in 2016 with Hispanics is that whatever the second sentence is, for all of them, the first sentence is, I will repeal the president's executive order, including Jeff. Every single one of them cannot get through the primary without pledging to repeal the executive order. And that, I think, changes the dynamic. One of the reasons the answer to your question is why, the feeling of why Hispanics have been demobilized is the feeling we vote and vote and vote and nothing happens, right? The Senate passed a bill in 2006, bipartisan bill, House didn't take it up. Senate passed a bipartisan bill in 2013, House didn't take it up. Now, though, the dynamic is different because the president, assuming that he survives court challenge, will have actually done something that the Republican presidential nominee, I feel pretty certain, is going to be promising to take away. I mean, whatever the second sentence is, if it's Jeb Bush, it will be, I will pass a legislative alternative. The first sentence is always going to be, I'm going to take away this thing that's been given to you. And that really goes to a larger point, which I think is kind of under, and it goes to what Roy was saying before about the prominence of social issues. The president is driving the debate in a lot of ways that can define both parties in 2016. I mean, he is taking, he has moved the Democratic Party to for better and worse, because there are costs, I'll talk in a second, he has moved the Democratic Party to a much more consistent, unified, left-of-center view on these social issues than was present even under Bill Clinton, by far. Every Senate Democrat voted for the pathway to citizenship when it was in the Senate in 2013. Every Senate Democrat voted for the ENDA bill, the Employee Non-Discrimination Act. It's inconceivable 20 years ago. Now, that, I believe, and you can go down the list on climate change, on gun control, and only 3 voted no. I mean, and Hillary Clinton, if she's the nominee, I think will inherit all of these policy positions. And there's a cost to that. I mean, that is part of the reason why Democrats are having so much trouble with culturally conservative working class whites in places like Arkansas and West Virginia. It is now a uniformly social liberal party. On the other hand, at the national level, these are majority positions, particularly with this emerging electorate of minorities, millennials, and the third piece of the Democratic coalition, white-collar whites, especially women. So, you see kind of the plus and minus, the balance sheet here for each party, in the sense that Obama is kind of annealing the Democratic identification with issues that are part of a national majority, but which also narrow the terrain on which they can compete, and the reverse is true for Republicans. I mean, they're being pushed into opposition to things that may work fine in holding Congress, but undoubtedly make it harder to win the White House.
Roy, let me ask you, in terms of that idea, Ron says that you would have to begin any conversation on the right, or from this 2016 field, by saying where you stand on the president's executive action. It seems to almost be a model that we've seen with Obamacare, which was repeal, repeal, repeal. Well, once the American public has it seems almost impossible to take it away from them, for better and for worse. Once their family members are being allowed to stay in the country. I mean, when the president announced it, as controversial as the executive action was, it sort of seems like once this is in place, it's going to be a real political liability to reverse it.
Sure.
And I wonder if you think policy-wise that holds true across other areas as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think you look at the vector of decisions that Ron was alluding to that Obama has made or helped promote, and the things that have passed. By and large, most of these things, if you look at the country as a whole, are fairly popular. There are things that resonate with the base of the Democratic Party, with a lot of these, with the minority vote, as we've been talking about. Obviously, the immigration issue very much qualifies there. You try to take that away, and that just helps mobilize, Obama got 70% of the Hispanic vote in 2012. I mean, Hillary Clinton, if she runs, might get 75 if things go on like this. I mean, I just don't see where the Democrats don't wind up with 80% of the minority vote again in 2016 if things continue on this course. And that means they can stand on a more secure three-legged stool, which is demographic change. Every 4-year cycle brings more of their constituencies into the mix. They want to try to mobilize more of their constituents that are now out there, like, for example, Latinos, like, for example, Asian Americans, like, for example, young people. And finally, can they get better white support? And I think that's the kind of interesting aspect of some of these stands we're talking about, some of these issues. It's not clear that standing against these issues, as the Republicans do, going forward is going to be a guarantee of continuing to maintain their high level of white support. It could work the other way. It could alienate college-educated whites, especially women, we're getting more of them every day. And the mix of whites changes in every election. Every presidential election cycle, we have a 3-point drop in white non-college voters and a 1-point increase in college-educated voters. So the mix of white voters is changing all the time. The generational mix of white voters is changing all the time. Millennial generation whites are far more liberal on these issues than silent generation whites, every year of which we have fewer. So, white people white people are not immune to demographic change. They are changing all the time. And the concept that these hardline positions that Republicans, at least at this point, seem committed to are, even if they are loser with minorities or a winner with the white vote, I think is really unclear. Let me just finish my point. Let me finish my point. Let me finish my point. My point is that, yes, I do actually. I'll say yes right now. But let me just finish my point that if you start compressing the white vote, the white margin for the Republicans in most elections, and certainly includes the presidential election, you don't have to compress it very far before they're at an astounding disadvantage. Republicans are now abjectly dependent on getting a 20-point or more margin among white voters. You start compressing that down to 15, and it's like there's no way they could put together a majority. So my personal view is I think Republicans, with their current stances and their current relatively hardline position, are really taking a risk in a lot of different ways, and not just with minority voters.
Alex, let me just respond to that a minute, because let's be straight about something. It's not like Hillary Clinton has been the Virgin of Guadalupe when it comes to immigration. She's not exactly the patron saint of immigration, and David Axelrod will remember that one of the big stumbles she had in 2008 was that driver's license question. And I think she's already stumbled this time around in issues like the children at the border and what her initial response to that was. And she hasn't had the promises that Obama so easily made. Maybe he didn't easily deliver, but he easily made. One of the things that happened in 2008 was that Obama promised the first year comprehensive immigration reform, where Hillary wasn't willing to go there that quickly. So I don't think, first of all, again,
but he got 71% of the Latino vote in his second election.
But Obama was running against, a guy who's self-deported from the White House. Jeb Bush is not going to self-deport.
Jeb Bush will solve all these problems. That's essentially.
No, he won't solve all these problems. He's not the patron saint, but But good luck
It's
trying
possible.
to paint a man married to a Mexican woman for 41 years as anti-immigrant.
Let me ask you, Karen,
But what if he is?
in your experience with Hillary Clinton. I mean, where is she? I mean, like, Bill Clinton was notorious as the first black president. He wasn't. And, you know, we talk about the sense of identity in the African American community with President Obama that, to your point, they came out and they wanted to vote back. Does Hillary Clinton, do the Clintons take minority votes for granted? Do you think that African American support will be as strong? And to Ana's point, you know, with Hispanic Americans, I mean, does she need to prove a bond for this?
I think whoever the nominee is, and this is just a cautionary tale I like to say to my party because they tend to pat themselves on the back way too soon. In 2016, no matter who it is, unless they're a person of color, they're going to have to work their asses off because both the black community and the Latino community, I think Ana would agree with me, is not a monolithic community. What it is to be a Latino in Colorado is not the same thing as in Florida. And among the black community, you have the black middle class who, you know, some of the issues that they're going to be talking about, maybe not necessarily some of the issues. So I do think that's part of the problem that was made in the past, and I certainly think that's only going to continue over the next couple of years. So I think in the 2016 cycle, to Hillary specifically, who I did work for, I don't now, but you know, the person that I know, actually, I mean, I was kind of shocked by the first part of her presidential campaign, I'll be honest. A person who is a change agent her whole life, to lose that argument, again, an abomination, malpractice, I've said that publicly before. And I think that with regard to minority communities, I think she will do very well. Do I think she'll get 75%? I'm not sure I'm willing to go there, but I think she will do very well. And I think she's I think similar to what Ana was saying about Jeb Bush, I think if Hillary Clinton decides to run this time, she's going to do it her way. And because I think she did learn that lesson from 2008, and I think she learned a lot of lessons from 2008. And one thing I know about this woman, she does not make the same mistake twice. That is not, so, and I take the criticism, I hear the criticism, and I make my own criticism about, for example, the book tour, but really technically the presidential, I mean, as much as everybody's obsessed with what she's doing, it hasn't started in earnest. And I think when she makes the decision to do it, you're going to see someone who is very aware of all of these issues. And I'll put it on the table, aware of the fact that, frankly, within the black community, there's still some very hard feelings about some of the things that President Clinton said. So, I mean, I think she's very aware of all of that.
Actually, when we talk about, you know, what resonates, ideally you would have both of these, but authenticity versus message. Is it, I mean, so there are a lot of people who are really authentic who aren't speaking to the people they need to, and then there are people who are speaking to the people they need to, but they don't seem authentic. If you had to choose, I mean, which do you think is more important for a candidate who's trying to speak to a new section of the electorate?
I think authenticity, I think this is, you know, you have this incredibly large, incredibly diverse generation with more access to information than any generation in history, with like insane bullshit detectors. Like they call bullshit like that. And I think that, you know, part of the success that we had this year at Rock the Vote with this one video that we did that went totally viral was it was just fun and authentic, and it was just real. You knew that it was real, and you knew what these people were saying was real. It wasn't scripted. And I think that that is really important. And I think the other thing that you see, and you know, it's interesting to have this, I mean, I know we have to have this conversation about, you know, which Democrat and which Republican and how are they going to come out on each, but at the same time, you have almost half of the millennial generation not identifying with a political party, and really, at the end of the day, just want to know where you stand on the issues they care about, and they'll tier it appropriately and determine whether they want to come out. So I think that, you know, part of the challenge that we will have at Rock the Vote in trying to get young people fired up about this is not falling into, here are your choices, the only two that, you know, you can choose from. It's to actually talk about and engage people in issues that they care about.
We have a little bit of time for Q&A.
Good.
There are people in the audience. If you could just say your name and maybe if you're directing your question to someone in particular, just let us know.
My name is Jake Smiley. This question isn't directed to anyone in particular. I'm just sort of curious if anyone would like to answer. Very early in the program, you were talking about the demographic shift predicted in the next couple of years, and in the, do you want me to hold this for you? Okay. And in particular about the issues about the way that the House of Representatives works, and the fact that each representative represents a small section of the country which will have different demographics from the country at large. How exactly do you expect particular districts to change? I mean, you talked about the idea of Democrats tend to come from large urban multiracial areas, their representatives, and Republican representatives tend to come from rural white areas, if I was to extremely simplify it. Is that going to change? What's going to happen in the future?
You know, it is changing. We're actually doing something this week, kind of tracking this over time. I mean, if you look, I mean, the minority population is not only growing, it is dispersing. You know, back in 1992, say, a quarter of the congressional districts were at least 30% non-white. So about a quarter of them hit that threshold. Now it's 235. It's a majority. But what has happened is that through both control of redistricting and the Democratic decline among whites, Republicans have been able to remain very competitive in districts where the minority population is growing, but hasn't kind of reached that critical mass to make the district Democratic. If you look at districts where between 30% of the population is non-white and half, Republicans actually have more of those districts today than Democrats do, even though Democrats have a clear majority in the over 50%. And just to add real quick, so demographic change is changing the nature of the House battlefield, but not rapidly. I mean, it doesn't happen overnight. And just kind of a quick broader point, which is that, you know, where we are is a very everything we've been talking about the last 40 minutes, I think, is a very precarious situation for each party and a very difficult situation for the country, because we're essentially in a position now where our partisan divide is increasingly intertwined with a generational and racial polarization, right? I mean, you know, the number of seniors is doubling over the next 40 years. We are aging as a society, but 80% of our seniors today are white. We are going through this explosive wave of diversity, but that is concentrated in the youth population. This is the first year ever in American history, this year now, when a majority of our K-12 public school system nationwide are kids of color. And these two giant generations are kind of jostling for control of the steering wheel with very different visions of the country, and for all the reasons I think we've been talking about, neither one is strong enough. You know, the sort of the Democratic side has the edge at the presidential level, the older white Republican side has the edge at the House level, and that leaves you in this kind of lengthy stalemate. And demographics will tilt that, but I'm interested in what other people have said this, but not overnight. I mean, a good example, I mean, maybe of the time frame we're looking at, is Republicans, the South tilted presidentially toward the Republicans in 1968. And Democrats did not win a majority of the House seats from the South until 1994. So it takes a while to seep down the ballot. And while that's going on, I think both parties are in kind of an unsteady position. But more importantly, the country is stuck, because you have these two, you know, separate but equal coalitions, I call them, that just cannot make a deal and cannot simply overpower one another either.
Let's go to this side.
Hi, do you want me to hold it? All right, thank you all for coming, first of all. And my question is, when conservative Republicans sort of go out to speak to minorities or young people, take Rand Paul, for example, you were talking about before, do you think we'll ever get to a point soon, I guess, or before the upcoming election, where it comes across as something more than overt pandering? Which, I mean, so far that's what it seems like, especially, you know, seeing certain campaign advertisements that are very directly, you know, going after these, you know, target groups, but don't feel authentic, like you were talking about.
Think quickly about Rand Paul, because he's actually created a bit of a conversation in the Black community, because I think parts of it, definitely, like Howard, let's be clear, right? Even to Twig, not so much. But partnering with Cory Booker, and I think and particularly from more of a libertarian independent perspective on prison reform and sentencing reform, I think people have really take that seriously, and it has actually caused a little bit of a tension within sort of, you know, sort of African American political leadership and some of the thought leaders that, like, well, wait a second, if this guy's willing to come take this step and come towards us, let's hear him out. And some say, no, it's total pandering. So I don't know how that shakes out in the end, but it's actually, because he's doing it in a way that seems more authentic to some, it is creating a little bit of tension.
To tell you the truth, I think that when it comes to Rand Paul, who's not exactly my cup of tea, or whiskey, I think he's very authentic. If he was trying to pander, remember, you got to get through a primary to get to a general. So if he was trying to pander right now, he'd be pandering to a different group. That's where he has the problem. More of the Republican mainstream, more of some of the evangelicals that don't agree with some of his more libertarian views on social issues. And I think it goes back to Alex's initial question about message versus authenticity. Look, if they don't go hand in hand, you got a problem. Because if you've got somebody that's authentically telling you the wrong message, that doesn't work. And if you've got somebody that's inauthentically telling you the right message, that doesn't work either.
Well, I can be old-fashioned, but I actually think a large part of this is what your policies are and what you actually stand for. I mean, one thing that makes pandering is you're basically putting a different face and maybe a slightly different rhetoric and what you've already been saying and whatever your policy set previously was. We haven't really changed. I think that's what makes it pandering. If you actually are changing your policy set so it aligns more closely with the interests of the people you're trying to reach, then I think to me that's less pandering, but I don't think that's what's happening. It's sort of a re-expression of what I said before, which is that what will make the Republicans truly appealing to these rising constituencies actually, to some extent, changing what they stand for and what policies they actually recommend. And then they can go out and try to recruit voters from these constituencies. I think it won't seem like pandering.
As to your point about the targeted, groups, I actually think that was one of the Obama campaign's magic pills. And one of the things that they did very successfully because it came across as authentic. I always remember, there was this ad that Obama did in 2008 where the entire ad was in Spanish. And I have to tell you, it was in perfect Spanish. And then I remember he got interviewed by Jorge Ramos and he got asked to repeat what he said. What did he say? He couldn't say one word because it was all, but it came across, it was the right message and it came across as authentic when it needed to. And, the Obama campaign was very good at that micro-targeting. They knew exactly, who was watching and what channel they were on and what website they were on and where to put those things. I remember Mitt Romney doing an event in Miami because he had message consistency paranoia, right? Because since he had been labeled the flip-flopper in 2008 and 2012, he was going to say the same thing anywhere he went, regardless of how different the places went. He gets to Miami, and there's country music, there's this going on, there's that going on at a Hispanic event, and we're all sitting there going, they do know it's Miami, Florida, not Miami, Ohio.
Yeah.
And he didn't mention Cuba.
Ashley, I'd like to get to the point about authenticity and to Roy's point about policy. The issue of voter suppression laws, voter ID laws, if you were talking about going to, and I think that probably everybody on the panel has thoughts about this, but especially among minority voters, especially among black voters, you go to Howard University, you go to Detroit, you go wherever you go, and criminal justice, I think, is a really important piece of, the Republican Party outreach. But if that is coupled, I just wonder if efforts largely supported by Republican lawmakers to in effect add more steps, I'm trying to be as euphemistic as I possibly can be, to the voting process, which disproportionately affects minority voters. I wonder how much any other outreach is canceled out by support for those policies.
Yeah, I think to the authenticity point, when your policy authentically represents your desire to make the electorate smaller so you have an easier chance to get reelected, it's really hard to come across with any other policies that seem authentic, like that you're actually appealing to these people. And I think that's the whole problem with voter turnout in general, particularly among young people. Like, I think the Obama campaign actually, they did incredibly well, is capitalized on this desire for hope and change, or at least owning that message and doing it authentically, because young people want to be inspired, they want to create change. This is a very entrepreneurial generation. that thinks nothing of starting a company or coming up with an app to fix a problem in the local community and can't understand how we keep sending these adults to go run the country who can't get anything done together. And it's a challenge. I mean, how many people in here have friends who didn't vote in the last election, made a conscious decision because they didn't think it mattered? I mean, I think we all do, right? And that's I think part of the problem.
So my name is JR. I went to Chicago Anti-Eviction Campaign and the Chicago Hip Hop Congress, who did work before with Rock the Vote to get out the vote. So I have a two-part question, one for Rock the Vote and one for the Democratic and Republican analysts. What impact did the governor's race have on the next presidential election, the 2016 election, right? This is a blue state, well, it was a blue state, Democratic city, Democratic county, Democratic state. About Illinois, right? And folks made a conscious decision, black folks and some Latinos, not to vote, right? Because they say, I can't blame a Republican for what has happened in a Democratic city, county, and state. And so they made a conscious decision not to vote, and it had an impact on our election. So what type of impact and rhetoric would you guys take from this state to push the national agenda? And then the second part of my question for Rock the Vote is what type of tactics, strategies, or planning is going on to increase voter participation? Because there's active campaigns in Chicago where they tell folks, and I don't endorse this message, although some of our members do, no land, no vote, right? We're not going to phony kick it, as we say in Chicago. If I don't have a house, if you foreclosed on me, I'm not voting from nobody else's address. So what type of tactics and strategies do you think both parties need to employ to get to make GOTV successful for the presidential election?
Karen, you want to?
Sure. I mean, I would just say, I go back to something I said before in terms of Illinois. You better give me a reason to vote, right? If you're not, so if my rationale is, well, I can't blame Republicans, then you better give me something else. Because if you don't, I'm going to go with my initial thought.
I agree. And in the Illinois particular case, I don't know that it's going to have that much of an effect on 2016. I think in some other states it will. But I'm not sure that Illinois is that case. And I frankly, I'm a very disciplined voter. I vote even when I don't like the person I'm voting for. And it was very hard. I mean, how can I blame a young person, or how can I blame anybody for not getting enthusiastic about Charlie Crist and Rick Scott? Have you met these guys? So I think part of that was that we frankly had a lot of candidates around the country that just, didn't get your juices flowing. You kind of want to fall in love a little bit, not just fall in line.
Ashley, you want to?
Yeah, I think I was saying this earlier before this started. We need to create a culture of voting and participation, and it needs to be cool. It needs to be the cool thing to do. That's how Rock the Vote was founded in the 90s with great success, and I think that I have people disagree with this tactic and theory all the time, but Katy Perry has 63 million Twitter followers and 81 million people voted in the last election. So, I think engaging... That's right. Kim and Kanye, they're pretty up there too. And so I think that, there is, you have all these young people who are looking at cultural leaders and who need to help us create a culture of voting, and we all need to do that for people who are coming up as well. I think this idea that having your parents take you to the voting booth as a kid, you get this sort of ingrained in you that it is your civic responsibility and it's a kind of a cool thing to do, is really important. I think the other thing is, and to the earlier question about pandering, and the thing that I think actually, when you were talking about Rand Paul and Cory Booker doing together, you see them having personal, Twitter conversations back and forth with each other. They are communicating on a platform where young people are, and I think that actually meeting young people where they are, you have over 90% connected online. There are platforms coming up every day, and Facebook is, as that sort of fades out, as the younger generation gets on and is mostly using Instagram, for example. Like candidates that have cool Instagram accounts are, like attracting more people following them, and it's another way to communicate. So I think that's part of the way to do it.
I don't know where we are in time, but I'm going to defer to you guys with this.
Maybe we should take one from this side.
Hi, my name is Lauren Taylor. Kind of a follow-up to your comment. We live in a society where everything is based upon its ability to appeal, attract people. I mean, even government policies have to justify themselves based upon how much they're being used, how effective they are. Voting seems to be the only thing that justifies itself, and that the people that are supposed to use it get chastised for not using it. Is it possible just that electoral politics, the way we have it, is just an outdated way to make policy? For instance, why are we going out still on a weekday in the middle of the winter?
Oh, sure. Look, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, if you really want to eliminate turnout differentials between the young, the middle-aged, and the old, and between minorities and whites, a variety of other turnout differentials that we see, one thing that you could do that we know from the experience of other countries quite effective is remove all the barriers. Basically get rid of registration, have the state keep the registration rolls, you could have voting open for weeks universally instead of go out in one day, and make it compulsory like they do in Australia and a number of other. You get turnout up to 90%, and everybody, the differentials between different groups, they vanish practically. So it's kind of, our system is not very effective about sort of encouraging democratic participation.
Well,
if we change the structure of the system, we could do much better. But I think that's a heavy lift at this point.
In my state, which is Florida, we have mail voting for 1 month, voting by mail for 1 month. We have early voting for 2 weeks, and then we have voting on the day of, and we still have low turnout. We had a very low turnout again this year. So, I think the compulsory thing works in some countries, but man, we'd go crazy in this country if they made us vote.
But why not, when you're 18, when you're a high school senior, instead of making it illegal for a teacher to give you a voter registration form, make that part of the curriculum, make that part of, citizenship.
Well, have the states maintain the list. Why should you have to register? It makes no sense. You're a citizen, you should be able to vote. Just have the state keep the
But it
list.
goes to the point of trying to make
Simple.
it more about citizenship and not just about take off work and go do this today.
Well, and I was going to say, to make it part of the curriculum, we just also can't forget how many cuts to civic education across the country there have been in schools, so that people are graduating from high school not knowing logistically what it means to be a participatory citizen in our country. And that's really difficult because it is kind of an intimidating process. We do go, just like they did in the 1800s, to a courthouse and stand in line with a bunch of people and, get there and not really sure. It's an intimidating process. And if we had better civic education, that would help.
I was just going to add that this round is only going to become more competitive because the political polarization between the groups that do and don't participate is getting wider. So, if you go back to even as recently as the 1980s, there was not that big a gap in the way people under 30 and the way people over 60 voted, right? But now, as we're going through this big demographic change where the under 30 population is increasingly diverse, and the over 50 population is still overwhelmingly white and it's becoming more conservative, there's this enormous gulf between the way people under 30 and the way people over 50, especially over 60, vote. The same thing, the gap between the way whites and non-whites vote is widening. The Republicans in the last 3 elections have had their 3 best elections ever in Congress in the history of polling among white voters. So you're seeing more separation, which means that small changes in the composition of the electorate have a bigger effect than they used to. Right? In this election, 2014, the minority share of the vote dropped 3 points and the youth share dropped, 6 points? I think, like 18 to 12. That mattered vastly more than it would have in 1986 because there wasn't that big a difference between the way old people and young people voted. Now, there's a huge gulf. So if anything, all the issues around participation are going to become more politically intense, and the question of who participates is going to become more consequential because, as I said, we're living through 2 demographic revolutions at once. We're aging and we're diversifying. I call it the brown and the gray. And these 2 forces are sort of contending for control of the country's direction, and small changes in participation will matter enormously in terms of which one ends up with the upper hand. So I think all of this only gets more fraud, not less, going forward.
Everything you're saying, Ron, is super informative and super depressing.
Yeah.
We have time for one
More question.
Hi, I'm Gregory Montoya Moore. I'm a grad student in romantic lighting. So I was wondering what state parties and the reform of state parties has to do with this bigger picture. We're talking about national, but a lot of this becomes extremely local, from like school boards to city councils to state legislatures, particularly when we're talking about redistricting. Could you guys talk about what's going on there?
the loudest. You want to take this?
Well, no, I mean, I work for a man whose vision was the 50-state strategy, and it has been, decimated, basically. And the idea, it wasn't perfect, but the idea, he was also somebody who in '05 was saying, hey, we should probably pay attention to redistricting in 2010, because we're going to get screwed if we don't. People thought he was crazy, just saying. But no, I mean, I think, sorry, it's my own personal pet peeve. But I do think, there was an idea, and it's very hard at the national level to get people to focus on the idea that, and I think the Republican Party has done it for generations far better than Democrats, on the idea that we should have professionals in our state parties who are able and have a vision of, we're going to run this person for, then lieutenant governor, then and we don't do that. And particularly among minority candidates, it's such a fight for them. I mean, I literally sat in a meeting with the Congressional Black Caucus many years ago where a very prominent African-American member of Congress said, that's why some are looking at running as a Republican and looking at the Republican Party more seriously, because they get told it's not your turn and the line is so long. So I think, revamping the state parties, I think after elections we should look at what talent we have in state, would those people stay in state, and actually professionalize how we, and as my former boss used to say, run a permanent campaign. And from the Democratic side, we don't, and it gets more complicated, I think, on both sides when you have the White House, because then the party and the state party are supposed to be doing the bidding of the president, and so somehow we need to sort of sort that out a little bit better, I think.
I would tell you, I don't know, have you ever been to a Democrat or Republican executive committee at a local level or a county level?
Yeah.
Okay, they are crazy. let's just start with that. And very, very, very difficult to get things done and things passed. What tends to happen in national elections is that the national folks dole out the money and really, do exert some control and discipline on what the local and state parties are doing. But it's not all the things that we're doing better, but I do agree that we tend to have deeper benches right now. When I look at Florida, for example, and let's say Marco Rubio decides not to run for Senate re-election. Who's going to run against? Who's going to run? Who would be the candidate on the Republican side or on the Democrat side? I can come up with probably 6 or 7 very viable names on the Republican side. The Democrat side is so shallow. They may have to run Charlie Crist again.
Or Martin O'Malley. I'm kidding.
You promised me. You promised me it will not be Charlie Crist.
I play. So we always play this joke where we say it's the last question, and then I say, no, I've got one more question. So a question and a comment. The question is, you guys have talked about this sort of stasis where the one dynamic governs the congressional elections, another dynamic governs the presidential elections. Which party is most likely to overcome their barrier and defy this principle? In 2016? Well, I think in the near term. In the near term, yeah.
I mean, I guess I'd argue Democrats only because I think, I think in 2016, as people say, the math is better for us and the numbers are, the demographics are better for us. And I think if there is a strategy put in place to really think about 2018 and how you make that electorate look more like the 2016 electorate, I think the numbers look a little better just on the surface, potentially.
I'm not, your question is, which do they overcome? So the one thing to overcome is the national, and the other thing is the congressional. On the national, I think for the Democrat side, everybody kind of assumes who the nominee is going to be, and so we plan according, and answer according to that. For the Republican side, we don't know who the nominee is going to be. I think it's going to be a very vigorous and lengthy primary, expensive one too. So I think it's too early on that front. Now on the congressional front, I think it's very difficult on the short term for the Democrats to overcome that barrier because those congressional districts are drawn and they will be drawn that way for 10 years. And it hasn't helped the Democrats, for example, that the blue dog Democrats, the moderate Democrats, have been decimated. In truth, it is, we tend to talk about the extremes on the Republican Party, but it's happened, sadly, in both parties, which is what has led to that great polarization that exists today in Washington. So your first question on the national for Republicans, TBD. On the congressional, I think very hard for the Democrats.
First of all, I just want to say, even though the lights went out, this was a really illuminating discussion. And I think a lot of important questions have been raised, and more challenges really than answers, which I think is why we got a lot of young people here who are going to inherit the implications of some of these challenges. I will say this, and Ron, your point was well taken about how little it takes to influence these elections, and some of these folks have heard me say this before, but I always think about the election of 2000, which ultimately was decided by 527 votes in Florida, and everybody can, yes, I know. I didn't mean to start that whole debate, but let's assume that that's the number. That's not a very large number in a country of 300 million plus, and so if 528 people had voted, had come out who didn't vote, had voted, it would have made a profound difference in policy. And whatever side you're on, you may like the policies that were chosen, in terms of fiscal policy, foreign policy, national defense, and so on. But nobody can argue that it wasn't a profound set of choices that were made in the years after that, based on an advantage of 527 votes in one state. So there are real implications of this. Ashley, I'm so moved by what you're talking about. I know, talking to these young people, that there's an open question as to what really is the efficacy of all of this, partly because of the stasis we see, and yet, Congress is going to, as I always say, Congress is going to meet regardless of whether we like it or not, and they're going to make decisions that have profound implications. So you guys have raised a bunch of questions. I think we have to keep thinking about it and finding a way to solve this dilemma, because there's such important decisions that are going to be made, and not me, but a lot of people in this audience are going to live with the implications of those decisions, and I think you're going to feel better about them if you help guide those decisions. But we have to persuade you that you can.
Now, David, since you brought up those 500 and some votes in my state, let me just tell you this Bill Clinton story. So I'm having, because Democrats, I don't know how many centuries it's going to be for them to get over those 500 votes, right? Never, right.
527.
By the way, I said, right there, you really opened up a Pandora's box. Exactly. But anyways,
that's a long time to get over that.
I'm having dinner with President Clinton in a small group a few months ago, and he brings it up, because I'm telling you that's a wound that is never going to heal. And I said to him, well, Mr. President, frankly, if Al Gore had only brought you to Florida that last week instead of shunning you, maybe we would have had to fight over the 520.
I bet you that was a well-received argument.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Wait. And this is what
Talk about pandering.
But this is what Bill Clinton. So I said, Mr. President, if Al Gore had only brought you to Florida in the last week, maybe we wouldn't have had that fight over the 500 votes. He would have, and he said to me, "You're right," but he still won.
Yeah.
Sounds like the guy we know.
Anyway, I want to thank you all. We couldn't, as I said at the beginning, we had the best possible group to discuss this issue and the best possible moderator, and you guys didn't let us down. So thank you very, very much.